Pine needles crunched beneath the heavy boots of the deputy. Gower smelled the damp wool of the lawman's coat before he saw the tin badge. Behind the cabin door hid a breathless, terrified woman he didn't know. To save his own skin, he'd have to claim her. Grease coated Gower's knuckles, thick and black from the bear trap he was trying to pry apart. The cabin smelled of rancid tallow, old coffee grounds, and the sharp, piney draft leaking through the chinks in the logs. He liked it that way. It smelled like isolation. He wiped his hands on a burlap sack, the rough fabric catching on his calluses. Outside, a heavy thud shook the porch. Not a branch. Too much mass. Gower froze. He didn't reach for his rifle immediately. He listened. The wind howled off the ridge, masking the subtle sounds of the forest, but beneath it, he heard a rasping, wet wheeze. Lungs fighting for air. He kicked the door open. The rusted hinges screamed. A mass of dark, mud-caked fabric lay heaped against his woodpile. Gower squinted against the biting wind. It was a woman. She was massive, her body a sprawling landscape of heavy curves and thick limbs obscured by a torn calico dress. Her face was pressed against the rough bark of the cut pine, her chest heaving in violent, jerky spasms. Annoyance, sharp and immediate, flared in his chest. He didn't want visitors. He especially didn't want dying ones. "Get up," he grunted, stepping onto the porch. She flinched. The movement was clumsy. She tried to push herself up on arms that trembled under her own weight. Her hands were scraped raw, fingernails packed with dark soil. She lifted her head. Her face was round, flushed and unhealthy, mottled purple from exertion. Strands of dirty blonde hair plastered across her cheeks, glued there by freezing perspiration. "Please," she choked out. Her voice was a cracked reed. Gower crossed his arms. "You're a long way from the trail, lady. Get moving." "Can't." She slumped back against the woodpile, defeated. The wood groaned under her shifting bulk. She closed her eyes. Let me freeze. It's faster." Gower stared at her. Pity was a useless emotion out here, one he'd discarded years ago along with his faith. But a corpse on his porch meant hauling dead weight, digging frozen earth, and dealing with scavengers. He cursed under his breath, a low string of profanities, and stepped forward. He grabbed her under the armpits. Her flesh was soft, yielding under his grip, but the sheer, dead weight of her shocked him. He grunted, his boots slipping on the frosted planks. "Help me, damn it!" he snarled. Martha forced her legs under her, driving her thick thighs upward. Together, they stumbled into the cabin. The doorway was narrow. Her hips scraped the frame. Gower dumped her onto the braided rug in front of the hearth. She hit the floor hard, a heavy, fleshy thud that rattled his cast-iron pans. He locked the door. The silence in the cabin was instantly broken by her ragged breathing. "Name," he demanded, grabbing a tin cup and dipping it into his water bucket. "Martha." She took the cup with trembling, sausage-thick fingers. She drank greedily. Water spilled down her chin, cutting tracks through the grime on her neck. "Who's chasing you, Martha?" She stopped drinking. Her dark eyes, buried under thick, swollen lids, snapped to his. The sheer terror in them made Gower's stomach sour. It wasn't the delicate fear of a frightened doe. It was the cornered, ugly panic of a butchered hog, realizing the knife was coming. "Nobody," she lied. Her voice trembled. "Nobody drove you up the ridge in freezing weather till your lungs bled," Gower said flatly. He walked to the window, peering out through the dirty glass. "You got 10 minutes by the fire. Then you're walking." "I don't harbor strays." Martha pulled her knees to her chest, a difficult maneuver that made her gasp. She wrapped her arms around her thick calves. She smelled of river mud, stale sweat, and old blood. "They'll hang me." Gower didn't turn around. "What did you steal?" "I didn't steal anything." She swallowed hard. "I killed him." Gower turned. He looked at her critically. The sheer mass of her, the soft, rounded shoulders, the shaking hands. "Who?" "My employer, the saloon owner down in Blackwater." Her chin quivered, but she bit her lip, forcing it still. He tried to put his hands where they didn't belong. Thought because I'm ugly, because I'm fat, I'd just take it. Be grateful. A bitter, harsh laugh scraped her throat. I pushed him. He fell backward, hit his head on the brass rail. Gower scrubbed his jaw. It bristled with a week's worth of graying stubble. A dead saloon owner. A woman running. It wasn't his problem. The world was full of men who deserved to die, and women who swung for it. 10 minutes, Gower repeated, turning back to the stove. Then the hounds bayed. The sound drifted up the mountain, a low, mournful, echoing chorus that made the hairs on Gower's arms stand up. Martha scrambled backward, her heels pushing against the floorboards, scraping herself into the dark corner near the flour barrels. She looked like a trapped animal, making herself as small as physically possible, which wasn't very small at all. "Please," she whispered. "Please." Gower weighed his options. Kick her out. Let the dogs tear her up on the porch, or hide her. His cabin was one room, a bed, a stove, a table. No cellar, no loft. "Get in the bed," he snapped. Martha blinked. "What?" "Get in the damn bed." She scrambled up, clumsy and frantic. She threw herself onto his mattress. The ropes underneath groaned in loud protest. Gower grabbed a heavy quilt, smelling of dog and old wool, and threw it over her. It covered her, but the mound beneath the blankets was massive. Anyone with eyes could see it wasn't a pile of clothes. "Face the wall. Don't breathe," he ordered. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed his whetstone and sat by the fire, dragging a hunting knife across the gray rock. Shk, shk. Footsteps hit the porch. Not dogs yet. A man on a horse had ridden ahead of the pack. Knuckles hammered on the wood. Gower didn't rush. He dragged the blade across the stone one last time, stood, and walked to the door. He unlatched it and pulled it open just enough to block the threshold with his broad frame. A man stood there, tall, raw-boned, chewing a wad of tobacco that bulged against his gaunt cheek. A tin star was pinned to a heavy buffalo coat. Deputy Amos Fowler. Gower knew him. Everyone on the mountain knew Fowler. He collected taxes with a heavy hand and enjoyed the sound of his own boots on other men's floors. "Fowler," Gower said. His voice was gravel. "Gower." Fowler spat a stream of brown juice into the snow beside the doorframe. He didn't ask permission before shoving his shoulder against the door, forcing Gower to step back or start a fight. Gower stepped back. Fowler walked in, bringing the smell of horse sweat and bitter cold with him. His pale eyes immediately swept the room. They lingered on the massive lump beneath the quilt on the bed. "Tracking a fugitive," Fowler said, his boots clicking on the floorboards. "Woman, heavy set, mean as a snake, crushed a man's skull in Blackwater yesterday. Haven't seen anyone." Gower remained by the door. Fowler walked closer to the bed. He stopped a foot away. The air in the cabin felt incredibly thin. Gower could hear the subtle, terrified creak of the bed ropes as Martha trembled beneath the wool. "You sure about that?" Fowler asked, turning his head slowly to look at Gower. A nasty, knowing smile touched his thin lips. "Looks like you got yourself some company, Gower. Awful big company." Gower felt a strange, cold calm wash over him. It was the same feeling he got when he stared down the barrel of a rifle. He hated Fowler. He hated the intrusion. He hated the arrogant smirk on the lawman's face, thinking he owned the mountain, owned the cabin, owned the lives inside it. He didn't plan the words. They just crawled up his throat, fueled by spite. "She's my wife." Fowler stopped. The smirk froze, then slowly melted into genuine, ugly incredulity. "Your wife?" "Yeah." Gower walked forward, placing himself between Fowler and the bed. "She's sick. Fever. I'd appreciate it if you didn't wake her." Fowler let out a sharp, barking laugh. "You're pulling my leg, Cole. You? Married? To a woman that size?" He pointed a gloved finger at the bed. "The fugitive I'm looking for is a fat cow, just like that mound under your blanket." Gower's jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward the knife on the table. "Watch your mouth, Amos." Fowler's eyes narrowed. He was a bully, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the shift in Gower's posture, the sudden, violent tension in his shoulders. Fowler took a step back, but his hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "Let's see her face, then," Fowler challenged. "If she's your wife, let me say, howdy." Gower turned. He approached the bed, his heart hammered against his ribs. If she panicked, if she fought, he'd have to kill a deputy, and then he'd be the one running. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the quilt. He peeled it back, just enough to expose Martha's face. She was a mess. Her face was still flushed, her hair tangled in a wet, dirty mop, but she kept her eyes closed, feigning sleep. Her chest rose and fell in deep, exaggerated breaths. Gower placed a heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. Beneath his palm, he felt the thick layer of fat and the dense muscle beneath it, rigid with terror. He squeezed, a silent, harsh warning. "Wake up, darlin'," Gower said. The endearment tasted like ash in his mouth. Martha groaned. It was a good sound, sickly, weak. She fluttered her eyes open, squinting at the light. She looked at Gower, then shifted her gaze past him to Fowler. "Gower?" she croaked, perfectly playing the invalid. Who's that?" Fowler stared at her. He studied her wide face, the dirt smudged on her forehead. He looked at her dark hair, comparing it to whatever description he'd been given. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Gower kept his hand firmly on her shoulder, feeling the heat radiating off her skin. "Deputy Fowler," Gower supplied, his voice hard. "Looking for a killer." Martha coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "A killer? Up here?" "Lord." She turned her head into the pillow. "My head aches, Gower. Tell him to shut the door. The draft is terrible." Fowler stood there for another long moment. He spat into the cold fireplace. A sizzle hissed through the quiet room. "Well," Fowler drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "I guess there ain't no accounting for taste. Cole, I'll leave you to your marital bliss." He turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "I'm making camp down by the creek. The hounds are tired. If your wife gets to feeling better, keep her inside. My dogs see a shadow that big moving in the brush. They might mistake it for a bear." Gower said nothing. He stared a hole through the back of Fowler's head. The door clicked shut. The heavy footsteps faded off the porch. Gower didn't move. He stood by the bed, listening until the sound of the hounds and horses faded down the ridge. Only then did he pull his hand away from Martha's shoulder. Martha sat up slowly. The quilt fell away. She looked at him, her dark eyes wide, chest heaving again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do that?" Gower walked over to the stove and shoved a fresh log inside, slamming the iron door shut. The loud clang made her flinch. He turned back to her, his face a mask of bitter regret. "Because I hate him more than I hate you," Gower said brutally. "And because now, if he finds out, I hang right next to you." He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at her. "You don't step foot outside this cabin. You don't make a sound. For all intents and purposes, Martha, you are my wife, and God help us both." Cast iron radiated heat into the cramped cabin, fighting the bitter draft slipping beneath the floorboards. Gower stood over the stove, turning slabs of salted pork with a long fork. Grease popped, stinging his knuckles. He didn't flinch. He was too hyper-aware of the heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from his bed. 3 days had passed. 3 days of Amos Fowler and his hounds camped a mile down the creek, their presence a heavy, invisible weight pressing against the timber walls. Gower plated the meat beside a heap of boiled beans. He walked to the table, grabbed a tin plate, and brought it to the bed. Martha sat propped against the rough log wall, the wool quilt pulled up to her double chin. She looked terrible. The flush of exertion had faded, replaced by a sallow, sickly pallor. Her dark hair hung in lank, greasy ropes around her wide face. He thrust the plate toward her. "Eat," he commanded. Martha hesitated, her thick fingers trembling as she took the warm tin. She kept her eyes lowered, fixing her gaze on the dark beans. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Dead women smell, and the ground is too frozen to dig." Gower walked back to his own plate at the table. sitting heavily in the wooden chair. It creaked in the quiet room. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against tin and the low hum of the wind outside. Gower watched her from the corner of his eye. She ate quickly, mechanically, chewing with a desperate hunger that made his stomach twist with a strange, uncomfortable pity. She noticed him looking and abruptly stopped, her cheeks burning a dark red. She lowered the plate to her lap. "I know I take up too much room," she mumbled, her voice thick with shame. "Too much food, too much space." Gower tore a piece of hardtack with his teeth. "You're taking up my bed. That's what bothers me." He had slept on the braided rug by the hearth for 3 nights. His back ached. His temper, already a frayed string, was close to snapping. He resented her bulk, her fear, the way she made his isolated sanctuary feel like a crowded prison. But mostly, he resented that he couldn't just throw her to the wolves. Martha set her half-empty plate on the floor. She gripped the edge of the mattress, her thick arms straining as she pushed herself up. The bedrobes shrieked. "What are you doing?" Gower snapped. "Giving you your bed back." She stood, swaying slightly, her weight shifting onto her battered feet. "I can sleep by the fire." "Sit down, Martha." "No." She took a clumsy step forward. Her torn calico dress hung askew over her wide hips. "I won't be a parasite. I killed a man. I brought the law to your door. The least I can do is let you sleep in your own bed." She took another step, but her knee buckled. 3 days of terror and adrenaline crash caught up to her all at once. She pitched forward. Gower lunged. He caught her by the shoulders before she hit the cast-iron stove. The impact drove the breath from his lungs. She was incredibly heavy, a solid, overwhelming mass against his chest. They stumbled backward together, Gower's boots scraping against the planks until his back hit the wall to keep them both upright. He held her there. She gasped, her face buried against his coarse flannel shirt. He could smell the unwashed, sour tang of her hair, the lingering scent of old river mud, and the sharp, acrid stench of raw fear. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into his chest, her large body quaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm just so heavy." Gower didn't push her away immediately. He stood pinned against the wall, his large hands resting awkwardly on her broad back. He felt the thick layers of flesh, but beneath them, the frantic, bird-like hammering of her heart. She wasn't just a fugitive or a burden in that moment. She was a terrified animal waiting for the butcher's block, convinced her own body was a sin. He remembered the saloon owner in Blackwater, the man she killed. Gower knew the type. Men who looked at a woman like Martha and saw something they could mock, something they could use and discard because they believed nobody else would care. A slow, cold anger coiled in his gut. Not at her, at the world outside the cabin. Gower gripped her arms, hoisting her back to her feet. He didn't speak gently, but the bite was gone from his voice. "You fall on that stove, you'll burn this whole place down. Get back in the bed." He guided her, practically carrying a third of her weight until she sank back onto the mattress. She pulled her knees to her chest, hiding her face in her arms, weeping silently. Gower walked to the door, grabbed his heavy wool coat, and pulled it on. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice muffled and panicked. "Outside. I need to smoke. I need space." He pulled the latch. The freezing night air rushed in, biting at his exposed neck. "Wash yourself while I'm gone. There's hot water in the kettle and lye soap on the washstand. You smell like a wet dog." He stepped onto the porch and closed the door, cutting off her reply. The wind was brutal, slicing through his coat in seconds. He pulled a bent cheroot from his pocket, struck a sulfur match against the frozen porch rail, and cupped the flame. He inhaled the bitter smoke, letting the freezing isolation numb him. He stood out there for 20 minutes, shivering, listening to the faint splashing of water from inside. He hated the cold, but he understood dignity. Even a woman running from the noose deserved to scrub the fear off her skin in private. Morning broke gray and sullen. Frost crawled up the inside of the window panes in thick, crystalline webs. Gower woke on the floor, his joints stiff, the embers in the hearth reduced to a dull, gray pulse. A new sound cut through the silence. Dogs. Close. Gower bolted upright, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his hunting knife. The baying was loud, sharp, frantic. They were right outside. Gower, Martha whispered. She was sitting up in the bed, the quilt clutched tight against her chest. Her face, scrubbed clean the night before, was bone white. Heavy boots hit the porch steps. Two distinct pairs. "Cole!" Amos Fowler's voice boomed through the solid wood. "Open up!" Gower pushed himself off the floor. He didn't bother grabbing his rifle. If it came to a gunfight, he was dead anyway. He walked to the bed, grabbed his boots, and shoved them on. "Lie down," he hissed at Martha. Turn toward the wall. Groan. She dropped back onto the mattress, curling into a massive, trembling ball beneath the wool. Gower crossed the room and threw the bolt. Fowler stood on the porch, flanked by a younger, nervous-looking deputy holding the leashes of 3 thrashing bloodhounds. The dogs were losing their minds, noses shoved into the snow by the porch, whining and digging at the frosted wood. "Morning, Amos," Gower said, keeping his body positioned squarely in the frame. "Dogs are loud." "They picked up a scent," Fowler said. He didn't smile this time. His pale eyes were hard, searching Gower's face for a crack. "Right around your woodpile, Cole. Funny thing, they brought us straight to your door." Gower felt a cold bead of moisture slide down his spine, the spot where he found her. "Lot of animals cross my woodpile," Gower said evenly. "Coyotes, bears, raccoons." "My dogs don't track raccoons," Fowler spat. He stepped closer, his chest almost brushing Gower's. "They track human blood, human sweat, and the scent leads right inside your little love nest." Gower didn't blink. "You calling me a liar, Amos?" "I'm saying I want to look inside," Fowler demanded, placing a hand on the doorframe to push his way in. Gower didn't yield. "My wife is sick. I told you that. She's finally resting. You ain't bringing those muddy boots and flea bags into my home." Fowler sneered. "I don't need the dogs. Tie him up, Billy," he ordered the young deputy. Fowler shoved past Gower, forcing his way into the cabin. The air was tense, smelling of stale coffee, lye soap, and wood smoke. Fowler walked straight to the center of the room, his eyes locking onto the bed. Martha was a mountainous shape under the blankets, facing the logs, letting out a low, pathetic moan. "Still sick, huh?" Fowler mocked loudly, stepping toward the bed. Must be a terrible affliction, making her gain all that weight, making her hide from the world. Gower moved. He was fast for a big man. He stepped between Fowler and the bed, his shoulder dropping slightly, ready to strike. "Back off." Fowler stopped, his hand resting on his revolver. "I just want to check her temperature, Gower. Make sure it ain't the Blackwater fever. Hear that causes people's heads to bash themselves in. She is my wife." Gower's voice dropped an octave, resonating with a dangerous, gravelly threat. "You touch her, Amos, and I will cut your hands off." Fowler stared at him. The cabin was dead silent, save for Martha's ragged breathing and the muffled whining of the hounds outside. Fowler weighed the odds. He looked at the size of Gower. The raw, violent tension coiled in his posture. He looked at the bed. The woman was massive, sure, but she was wrapped in a domestic quilt, smelling of cheap soap. Maybe he was wrong, or maybe he just didn't want to die over a saloon owner who owed him money anyway. Fowler let out a long, slow breath. He took his hand off his gun. "All right, Cole," Fowler muttered, taking a step back. "All right, but I'll tell you this. The pass is snowed in. Nobody gets off this mountain until the spring thaw. If I find out you've been playing me, I'll hang you from the highest pine on the ridge. Have a safe ride down, Amos." Fowler turned on his heel and marched out the door. He yelled at the younger deputy, swung onto his horse, and spurred the animal hard. Gower stood in the doorway, watching them ride down the trail. He watched until they were tiny black specks against the white expanse. And then he watched until the specks vanished entirely. He closed the door and slid the heavy iron bolt home. He leaned against the wood, letting out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 3 days. Behind him, the bed ropes creaked. Martha sat up. She threw the quilt off, her chest heaving. She looked at Gower, her dark eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "He's gone," Gower said quietly. He walked over to the stove and numbly reached for the coffee pot. "You defended me," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of profound disbelief. "You could have stepped aside. You could have let him take me." Gower poured the black, bitter sludge into a cup. He looked down at the dark liquid. He thought about the sneer on Fowler's face. He thought about the sheer, terrified weight of her against his chest the night before. "I told you," Gower said, not turning around. "I don't harbor strays." He turned, holding 2 cups of coffee. He walked to the bed and handed her one. Their fingers brushed. Hers were warm, thick, and surprisingly soft. His were scarred and rough, like tree bark. "Pass is snowed in," Gower said, sitting heavily in his chair by the table. He took a sip, the bitter liquid burning his throat. "Nobody leaves till spring." Martha wrapped her large hands around the tin cup, absorbing the heat. She looked around the tiny, cramped cabin. She looked at the hardened, cynical man sitting across from her, a man who had claimed her, sheltered her, and lied to the law for her. "Spring is a long way off," she murmured. Gower met her gaze. The annoyance was gone, replaced by a quiet, reluctant acceptance of their shared reality. "Then I suggest you learn how to make better coffee, wife. If this raw, gritty slice of the West pulled you in, don't leave just yet." Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates real, flawed characters, and subscribe to the channel for the rest of Gower and Martha's journey. The wilderness holds more secrets, and their survival is far from guaranteed. Drop a comment below. Would you have lied to the law? We'll see you in the next part.